Okay, let's get back to the PowerPoint and get back to our cost of production. Okay, so we kind of moved around there a little bit, but in our last slide, before we stopped, we had done our equivalent units of production. So we had calculated, you know, as far as materials, we had 60,000 ending equivalent units for direct materials and 59,250 in regards to conversion. So once we know our equivalent units for the period, that's when we can calculate a cost per equivalent unit. That cost per equivalent unit is will then allow us to assign costs to beginning inventory, started and completed, and ending inventory. Okay. So the cost per equivalent unit is actually, as you can imagine, pretty easy to calculate. You're just dividing. So your total materials cost per equivalent unit, you're going to take total direct material cost for the period. So they'll tell you what is our total materials cost added in the period, and we're just going to divide it by the 60,000 equivalent units of materials. So total cost divided by total equivalent units gives us a cost per equivalent unit. Makes sense, right? So then they're actually showing us how, first in the first group, they're showing us our equivalent units again as a review, so we know what we had. And then now they're giving us our costs. So materials costs in the period were $66,000. So total materials were $66,000. And then total conversion costs were $17,775. Okay, so that's just a given. So direct materials cost per equivalent unit, we take the $66,000 cost they gave us, divided by the 60,000 equivalent units. So we have a materials cost per EU of $1.10. For conversion costs, we take the $17,775 total conversion cost that they gave us and divide it by the EUs for conversion, the 59,250. Conversion costs are 30 cents per gallon. So now we can use those costs and figure out our costs that were transferred to the other department, what's in ending inventory. Okay, so we're going to use this cost, these direct costs per EUs or equivalent units, to calculate our costs. So our step 4 in our process here is allocating costs. So they give us our total production costs to account for. Okay. So this is July. We had 90,000 total production costs. So they told us we had beginning inventory, total inventory in process 6225. And then here's that step they just gave us: materials, labor, and overhead. So total costs in July were 83,775. So total production costs are 90,000. So that's all the production costs in the month of July. Then we need to assign them. Notice at the end, we want our total to be 90,000. So that's always our checkpoint. We have to assign the total costs 2 or 3 groups: beginning inventory, started and completed, and ending inventory. And again, we're just going to use our equivalent units and our price per equivalent unit. So this part's just keeping track, you know, multiplying. So in this case, we know our total beginning inventory costs were $6,225. To complete those in beginning inventory, well, again, we had 0% or 0 equivalent units of direct materials in beginning inventory. So there's 0 costs added for materials in beginning inventory. For conversion costs, we had equivalent units of 1,500 in beginning inventory. So we take 1,500 times 30 cents. So it would take us another $450 to complete what's in beginning inventory. So that's the cost we're assigning, okay? And then that's the cost of July 1 in process inventory transferred to packaging department. Okay, that cost gets transferred out. The second group was what was started and completed. Well, again, those were 100%. So our equivalent units was 57,000, both for materials and conversion. So we just multiply them by their cost per equivalent unit. Okay. So cost of the units started and completed, 62,700 for materials, 17,100 for conversion, a total of 79,800. So right now we have cost of July 1 in process, that beginning work in process, and then group 2, the started and completed. So the only group we have left to assign cost to are ending inventory. Ending inventory was 3,000 gallons. Those were 100% complete with materials, so 3,000 times $1.10. Conversion costs, we had 750 equivalent units times 30 cents. So all total 3,525 costs in ending inventory. So when we finish assigning costs, we add up all three groups, beginning inventory plus started and completed plus ending inventory. We've assigned the full $90,000 worth of product costs for the period. So that's always your checkpoint. You want to get to that. You want to add up all your total production costs. And when you're done assigning based on equivalent units of production, your total cost should be the same. Any questions there? So then last but not least, you get to do the big fun cost of production report. So it is, like I said, a little tedious. It's the tricky part of this chapter. Not really tricky, but it's just lengthy. So you're really going to go through all those steps. You're going to figure out what units to account for. You're going to figure out total production costs. You're going to calculate cost per equivalent unit. You're going to allocate costs, all of that. So everything we just did all in one report. Sounds super fun, right? Yeah. This is what you've been waiting for your whole life. I know it. So again, this is really long and that's really hard to see. It is on your notes. I know it's still a little hard to read. But this is what we'll be working towards. Probably on Thursday, we'll do our full cost of production. So this is really just everything we've done so far today, all in one big long report. Okay, so we'll chunk it out. We'll take it step by step. So the last thing I want to cover before we leave today, and then we'll just have 2 exercises to cover on Thursday, are the journal entries. So really, your journal entries, again, are very similar to what they were in last chapter. The only difference now is we have more than one work in process. So we still take materials, we still take labor, we still take overhead and apply it into work in process, okay? It's just going to look a little different. So when we requisition materials, or when we purchase materials first, when we purchase materials on account, both direct and indirect, it's the same journal entry. Materials debited, accounts payable credited. When we get to when those materials get requisitioned and when we add in labor and overhead, the only difference now is we're using specific work in process mixing, work in process packaging. We're just putting it into the different work in process accounts. But it says the mixing department requisitioned milk, cream, and sugar of 66,000. Well, that goes into the work in process mixing. So we're still adding materials into work in process. We're just saying specifically into mixing. And then materials of 8,000 were requisitioned by the packaging department. So work in process packaging, 8,000. Indirect materials get charged as actual factory overhead, right? So those get debited to factory overhead for mixing and factory overhead for packaging. And then we credit materials, showing it coming out of our total materials. So we had 88,000 materials and we requisitioned 81,125. So again, this is really not too different. It's just separating out the different work in processes, okay? So the journal entries aren't too bad. Same with labor and overhead. We're just separating it out. Labor, 10,500 to mixing, 12,000 to packaging, total labor is 22,500. Overhead, they just give us the total, but we now know how to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. We already did. Overhead for mixing, $33.50. Packaging, $1,000. And that was for depreciation on the equipment, so $43.50 gets credited there. Oh, that was actual overhead. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. On Part D there, those are actual overhead costs. That's why they're debited to factory overhead and credited to accumulated depreciation. Part E is applied. So E, we applied factory overhead. Work in process gets charged for both of those applied, and factory overhead gets credited. And then F, when we transfer from one department to the next, so work in process packaging gets debited, work in process mixing gets credited. The 86,475 was finished in mixing, so it was credited out and debited or transferred to packaging. Okay. And then from your packaging department, 106,000 were finished, so we credited those from packaging and debited finished goods. So your cost flows are the same. What you're debiting and crediting, you just have to break it down into more than one work in process. And then cost of goods sold still gets debited and finished goods get credited for what we sold in the month. And then they give you a nice slide you could always, print out for a refresher. But this is what you're seeing your T accounts. Okay. So here's our materials that we purchased, what was requisitioned. Those requisitioned materials go into mixing and both mixing and packaging. Direct materials went in work in process, indirect got charged to factory overhead. So it's showing you the T accounts of what we just went through. So again, materials is the same. The only difference with your work in process is you have two now, but you have beginning inventory, materials added, labor added, overhead added, what was completed and transferred out. Okay, so it's really, again, the same flow. You're just adding another work in process in. And then we can do total inventories just like we did before. So they're just balancing T accounts to get ending materials, both work in processes and ending finished goods. So total ending inventories is just the balance of those T accounts. Any questions on that? What's this about? Okay. That's really what we're done with for this chapter. I don't think there's any. Yeah, we're not going into lean manufacturing or anything, so we can stop there. Any questions on that stuff? Not yet. I know it's a little confusing, but it'll start making sense. So on Thursday, we'll do a few journal entries together for what we just looked at, and then we'll do that big cost of production report. And then we should have, I imagine that might take us 20, 30 minutes to get through, and then we'll have the remaining time to work on homework. So be working on, try to finish up 15 and 16, and then bring your questions Thursday for those as well. Have a good day.